Dominic Grieve is a British barrister and was the Member of Parliament for Beaconsfield from 1997 to 2019. His father was British and his mother half French. He was educated at the French Lycée here in London, St. Paul's Prep School and Westminster School. He read history at Oxford before qualifying for the bar in 1980. In Parliament, he was Shadow Home Secretary in 2008 and Shadow Justice Secretary in 2009. He was made Attorney General of England and Wales and Advocate General for Northern Ireland in 2010 and kept the post until 2014. From 2015 to 2019, he was chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. He lost the Conservative whip over his opposition to no-deal Brexit and his support for a second referendum in 2019, and stood unsuccessfully as an independent in the general election last year. Mr. Grieve also has ties to our French community here, as he is the president of the Franco-British Society. He was awarded the Legion of Honor, la Légion d'honneur, in 2016, and broadcasts in French on French radio and television. He is a practicing Anglican and was a member of the London Diocesan Synod of the Church of England. Mr. Grieve has kindly accepted the group Gaudite's invitation to speak to us today. Gaudite is a group of students and young professionals within the Notre-Dame de France parish. And this year we have been reflecting on the social teachings of the Church, la doctrine sociale de l'Église. To that end, we decided to ask Mr. Grieve to speak to us about his faith and the way in which it impacts his job in politics. We thank you very much, Mr. Grieve, to have kindly accepted our invitation. It's such an honor to have you here. We've been looking forward to hearing you speak and to having the privilege of asking you some questions. We're also happy to have with us tonight a small group of Christian entrepreneurs and executives, les entrepreneurs et dirigeants chrétiens, ou EDC, who are another group within Notre-Dame de France studying and reflecting on the social teachings of the Church. In a minute, I will hand over the microphone to Mr. Grieve. We will have time for a Q&A afterwards, so please feel free to send me any questions you have for Mr. Grieve in the chat during the talk or after. Please write your questions to me directly in the chat box, as I will be moderating the questions in a chronological order. If you wish to ask a question directly to Mr. Grieve, please say so in the private message you send me, and I will give you the floor to unmute yourself to ask your question when it's your turn. There are quite a lot of us here tonight, so I would like to ask you to please stay on mute for the talk. If you're accidentally not muted, the host will mute you again. So don't worry about that. Please also note that the first part of this talk will be recorded, not including the Q&A. We're only recording the speaker, Mr. Grieve, so all of you attending this talk won't appear on the recording. If you have any questions regarding the recording or anything else, feel free to send a question in the chat to myself or any other of the hosts. I'm now going to hand over to Mr. Grieve to speak. There you go, Mr. Grieve.
Thank you, Alexandre. And thank you very much for asking me to join you this evening. I have memories of coming to Notre-Dame de France from time to time when I was very little, usually for events which concerned friends of my parents. And so it's wonderful to see the church in such good health and so vigorous. Now, you set me quite a difficult topic for the evening. Can politics and faith be reconciled? So what I thought I would try to do was, firstly, because this is what was asked of me, was to speak a bit about my faith and how I came to it, and how that's impacted for me personally on my politics and the way I've tried to practice it, and some of the difficulties which can arise. And then I thought I might just say a very brief word about religion in the political context in the United Kingdom, because I'm slightly conscious that the UK is significantly different from France in respect of that, and it may well have a bearing on the future, on the conversation that we have afterwards. But I won't dwell on that too much, but I think it's worth just touching on. So start with faith. I come from a, I suppose, rather curious family in a way. My father was baptized in a Catholic church because his mother was a Catholic Irish. But by the time he got to university, and my grandfather was killed in the First World War, my paternal grandfather. But by the time he got to university, he'd reverted, I think, or I don't think my grandmother was très pratiquante, really, at all. And by the time he got to university, he was confirmed as an Anglican. So he took his Anglicanism reasonably well. Anglicanism has always had it's always described as latitudinarian, which means that it's quite elastic in its concepts. The product of our civil war in the 17th century and the need for tolerance. And I think he was quite an agnostic Anglican. My mother, brought up in Paris, but with an English mother and a French father, her French father, although he'd been an enfant de chœur in the church in La Châtre, and he was an army officer, had clearly become what I think it was called in France a free thinker, un libre penseur, by the time he got to Saint-Cyr in the 1890s. And so it was my grandmother's English Anglicanism which was dominant for her, and she was confirmed in the Anglican Church in Paris. After their marriage, I think that they took their faith with some seriousness. When we were very little, we used to go to a monthly children's service in Holy Trinity, Brompton, which in those days was a church which had not yet acquired its sort of major evangelical luster, which it currently now has. It was rather more straightforward evangelical Anglicanism. But apart from that, as my father got busier with his career, we would go to church on Christmas Day. We would probably go to church on Easter Sunday, but otherwise they were not practicing. And my faith developed really at school. I was at a boarding school at Westminster, and at a time when there were quite a few problems in my own life, and also in my family's, because my sister was very ill, something which eventually killed her. And I was aged 14, 15, and I came to the time when I was confirmed in Westminster Abbey. And so I think faith started to take on a meaning for me that was slightly different, perhaps, from other members of my family, and something which I felt at a very personal level. But that having been said, although I think I took it quite seriously at school, I don't think I took it very seriously at university at all. There were plenty of opportunities at Oxford to be involved with the chapel of my college, but although I would go to evensong occasionally to listen to the music, and I might on occasion once a term go to the Sunday communion, followed by the sandwich lunch, which took place in summer sitting out on the grass, and which would bring me in touch with those who actually took their religion much more seriously. I think I rather moved away from it. And that remained the case when I was down in London. Although I would pray privately, I was not a participant in a community, a worshipping community. And apart from going to other people's weddings and Christmas and Easter, I didn't really involve myself in the life of the church at all. So the change for me came on marriage. My wife, Caroline, had come from a rather similar background, not particularly religious, but I think she'd sung in the choir of her local parish church, and I think her father took his religion quite seriously. Her mother she's still alive, very agnostic in her views. But we took getting married, I think, fairly seriously. We went away on honeymoon, and when we came back, we moved into my house in Fulham. She came back from a shopping expedition and said to me, you know, there's a church around the corner. And I have to say, I'd been living there for 6 years and I hadn't paid the slightest attention to it. And so we both came to a decision that we would go there the following Sunday. And effectively, with occasional gaps for holidays, or for me walking on the hills in Scotland, we've been going to church every Sunday since, at the same church, albeit there are two churches within the parish, which of course brings a rather different complexion to faith because it introduces a certain rigor, and it also has, I think, the great merit that it involves one with large numbers of other people, actually from a multiplicity of backgrounds, often very different from one's own, who also have faith and have come together because they believe in it. And the position today is that my wife is the church warden of the church. I occasionally sing in the choir, not particularly well, but that's what I do. And our two boys, as we were bringing them up, have certainly gone to church, come to church with us when we're at home. And I suppose I'm therefore described myself as a practicing member of the Church of England. And I've certainly found faith immensely sustaining, personally, to me, during the course of my life and through every trial and tribulation, as well as every celebration that has taken place for me. I am contemplating, if COVID permits, heading off to Le Puy-en-Velay at the end of February, and I have decided that this is the year before I get too old to walk to Santiago de Compostela. So if it works out, by the time I get back in May, I will have done more pèlerinage, but it's slightly dependent on the accommodation being available. And Caroline will not come with me, but she will come certainly to Santiago to meet me if I finish this particular adventure. How does that impact on politics? Well, that brings me, I think, a little bit to the feature about the United Kingdom, which I think is significantly different from France. In France, of course, the absolute foundation of the French state, as it currently is, and as the current president, Monsieur Macron, has been re-emphasizing, is la laïcité. And whilst religion is tolerated, and indeed is given the facility to manifest itself, France has sought to develop itself into a secular state, which, whilst giving religion space, sees itself as anchored on different ethical premise. Now, the United Kingdom, in some ways, is very similar if you look at the levels of religiosity. Obviously, around 50–60% of the population describe themselves as Christian, but it's going down. It was about 72% 15 years ago. And of course, there are new religious groups that have come in, which have made religion much more prominent than it was. And because of immigration, particularly from Eastern Europe, Poland in particular, the Catholic Church has experienced a significant revival. And it's right to say that the Anglican Church in Britain is reviving in cities, curiously not doing very well in rural areas. But on the whole, we are moving towards a more and more secular outlook, and that is reflected, and I'll come back to that in a moment, on the sort of legislation that Parliament is thinking of enacting. On the other hand, the foundations of the English/British state are absolutely rooted in Christianity. Indeed, because we don't have a written constitution, the only constitution we have, effectively, is that the Queen takes an oath before God at her coronation. And she is described, of course, in her titles as the Defender of the Faith, a title given to Henry VIII by the Pope before Henry VIII misbehaved. And when she comes to open Parliament, she makes a speech at the end of which she asks that the blessings of Almighty God should rest on our councils, not, I think, something that Monsieur Macron would do if he turned up to l'Assemblée Nationale. Parliament, the Speaker of the House of Commons, even though the last Speaker was a non-practicing Jew, John Bercow, has a chaplain, an Anglican chaplain, who is appointed to lead the prayers at the start of every session of the House of Commons. The Queen, in taking her oath, says, "Faith and truth I shall bear unto thee." And the basis of the social contract, our contrat social in Britain, is that between the Queen and her subjects, which is based on Christian principles. And our subjection to the Queen, although lots of people don't realise it, is really based on the principle that she will herself observe God's holy ordinances. And Queen Elizabeth II has not been bad at doing that. Indeed, it's pretty clear that she takes that very seriously. And one of the other features, again, I think sometimes overlooked because we don't have a constitution, is that effectively the entire hierarchy of the state in Britain is based on people being the Queen's servants. If you're a High Court judge, if you're a police officer, if you're a High Sheriff, if you're a mayor, if you're a member of Parliament, if you're a member of the House of Lords, if you're an army officer, you have all got to prêter serment to the Queen. Now, of course, you can actually nowadays affirm, and if you're a Muslim, you can take your oath by Allah. But ultimately, the vast majority of people take their oath to the Queen, as I did when I became a Privy Councillor, I became Attorney General, quite complicated oaths actually. They are all based on service to the Queen, subject to the Queen's service to God. So it is the absolute contradiction of an atheist state. And I can't think of anywhere else, probably on planet Earth, apart from theocracies like Iran, which I don't wish to emulate, where this exists. And yet, interestingly, as I was explaining, it exists alongside what are now highly secular ethics, which is very different from where we were, say, 50 or 60 years ago. Lord Hailsham, who was a distinguished Conservative politician, wrote a book called The Case for Conservatism, which I was a Conservative politician before I became an independent. And he wrote that in the 1950s. And he said, the case for conservatism, he said, there could be no genuine conservatism, by which he was referring to British conservatism, which is not founded upon a religious view of the basis of civil obligation. And there can be no true religion where the basis of civil obligation is treated as purely secular. Now, that having been said, most of the ethical politics, I think, divides in two. Obviously, most of politics is about the affairs of men and not of God. Now, we may all, I certainly believe as a Christian, that we need to try to further the common good, an expression which I think is very widespread within Catholic Christianity, but also exists very widely within Anglican Christianity as well. And the common good is something, the sum total of the goods that can be done by individuals coming together to serve their communities. But lots of the decisions, should you raise or lower taxes, should you spend more money on defence, should you spend more money on health, are complex issues where Christians may properly take very different views. There are also some issues which have intensely ethical angles to them. And the one merit, and I think perhaps particularly, may also exist in France, but it's certainly the one merit of the Christian foundations that we still have remotely in the background of our political processes in the United Kingdom, is that they are always treated as ethical issues and therefore as free vote territory. So if it's abortion, or, which looks more and more to be coming down the track, euthanasia, something which fills me with a considerable degree of horror, but appears to be becoming more popular in European countries, and I think is going to rise up as an issue. Or indeed, issues around sexuality and marriage, civil partnerships, all present a series of challenges where actually members of Parliament are left to make up their own minds and nobody will criticise them for what they decide to do. In any case, even those issues, in my experience, are not necessarily amenable to a simple answer. And in the course of my time in Parliament, I've tried working with fellow parliamentarians on cross-party basis who are also Christians. There is a core of Christians in the House of Commons, certainly, and probably more in the House of Lords who are active. One tries to steer a course, mindful of the fact that all politics in democracy requires compromise, because politics is the art of the possible. Whilst there may be some things over which you cannot compromise at all, there may be issues on which you should compromise because that is going to lead to the best possible outcome. Just to take an example, which is abortion. I happen not to believe in abortion. I think it's contrary to my Christian principles and contrary to Christian teaching. But the fact is that we have it in the United Kingdom. So the question arises, is it better, for example, to have the system that we have at the moment, which I think is fundamentally dishonest, because it requires doctors effectively to falsify the grounds on which abortion should take place, and also allows abortion to take place to quite a late stage of pregnancy, or might it be better to move to a situation where the choice was simply left to the woman who was carrying the child, but actually you reduced it to say 12 weeks? That's the sort of ethical dilemma to which, and might there be a better chance of getting that if one supported it than of maintaining the current system, which in my view, and I certainly felt it very strongly when I was Attorney General, is simply a piece of serious hypocrisy that we introduced in the 60s when, as you'll be aware, we said that 2 doctors had to certify that it was in the interests of the mother's mental health or physical health that an abortion should take place. Whereas, as we actually know, these things are signed off routinely without, in many cases, any discussion with the mother whatsoever. So that's just an area of example which I've tried to put forward. There will be many others, and indeed in the conversation that we have, we may wish to touch on other matters. So far as preserving what I see as the Christian foundations of the country, obviously that under the current pressures of secularization is quite difficult, and we have to recognize that in a democracy people are going to have freedom of choice. One thing, though, I'm absolutely convinced about is that Christians should be involved in politics. Obviously, the risk is there that by being involved in politics, you may end up making the wrong decisions, or indeed finding that your own moral principles may be sullied or may be compromised. But the alternative of taking Christians out of politics, which has been a trend which has been growing in Western society, with people just stepping back and saying they don't want to be involved, and actually minority faiths face the same issue because some of the things they have to say are unpopular. But I think it's really important that this should be maintained. And when one looks at what has happened in the United Kingdom over the centuries, most of the major changes of social progress, particularly in the 19th century, were entirely based on Christian beliefs and principles in action. Whether it's Elizabeth Fry and prison reform, whether it's the Earl of Shaftesbury and the reform and bringing in laws to prevent child labour in the 1850s and 60s, whether it's actually the charitable work of the Rothschilds for the Jewish community, they all had a religious foundation. And as I can see for myself, I'm currently carrying out a governance review for a very large Islamic charity called Islamic Relief Worldwide. But it does an enormous amount of good, indeed cooperates with Christian charities. But its funding, £130 million a year, of which about a quarter comes from the UK, is entirely based on the willingness of actually quite poor people to give of their money during Ramadan and to do good things with it for the common good, not just for other Muslims, because in fact some of their charitable work takes place in environments where Muslims are not necessarily present. Back in 1785, a great Christian and a great politician was William Wilberforce, who was absolutely torn between his Christianity and his involvement in politics, and of course was beginning to campaign for the end of the slave trade. And he wrestled very, very hard in his mind over whether political ambition was compatible with his faith, which was deepening and indeed became more and more pronounced as his life went on. And he considered withdrawing from public life altogether. But William Pitt, who was a great prime minister, I'm afraid a bit of an ennemi de la France after the French Revolution, before he died in 1806, wrote to him and said, "Stop being so stupid." He said, "You're deluding yourself into," I quote, "into principles that have but too much tendency to counteract your own object and to render your virtues and your talents useless to both yourself and mankind." And Pitt went on to say, "If a Christian may act in the several relations of life, must he seclude himself from all to become so? Surely the principles and practices of Christianity are simple, and lead not to meditation only, but to action. And of course, in William Wilberforce's case, it led very much to action, and he used his parliamentary position to promote the repeal of the slave trade and its outlawing, and was successful in doing it. So I think on balance, as a politician who has Christian faith and very mindful of the fact that I'm as much a sinner as anybody else, and indeed I am going to make political mistakes as much as anybody else, I do derive this immense reassurance from the fact that there is this very, very long tradition of Christian involvement in the political life of my country, and there's a huge amount to draw inspiration from. And because of that, I take the view that there is every good reason for Christians to be involved in politics. I'm a bencher of the Middle Temple, which is the Inn of Court. It's a confrérie d'avocats. And that too has, although it now has Muslim benchers and Hindu benchers and atheist benchers, plenty of those I'm sure around. We always have grace, which is a very Anglican thing, before our meals. And we're always, part of the prayer is that we are, says that to give thanks for our food, and then that we should use it to be rich and plentiful in all good works. And that seems to me to be the very essence of what Christianity is about. And I hope very much, therefore, that that tradition will continue. I'm now out of Parliament. I'm not completely out of politics, but I actually think that the Christian ethics in politics in this country, but I suspect actually it applies in France as well, are much more present than people appreciate, because ultimately, of course, the whole of Western Europe is founded, indeed most of Eastern Europe is founded on Christian principles as its foundations. There, I hope that's got some conversation going. I'm very mindful as a politician that there's a tendency to deliver what you think people want to hear, and other people may decide that there are things I haven't touched upon which I shouldn't have done, which I should have done, in which case, please raise them. And I look forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.